Rancher spent his fortune buying a farm, then found a giant girl hanged inside. The rancher had always dreamed of owning land. Years of toil in oil rigs and stock trades left him with a fortune, but the money felt hollow, like paper with no soil under it. He longed for silence, for mornings when the sun spread itself white across fields that belonged to him alone. When the farm came up for sale, he signed the deed without hesitation, pouring nearly every cent he had earned into the purchase. He felt the weight of his fortune vanish, replaced by a deeper, more solid weight, the kind that comes from roots. The first days on the farm were filled with an almost childlike wonder. He walked the fence lines, ran his hands through tall grasses, and traced the beams of the old barn as though memorizing the bones of a body. It wasn't just a property, it felt inhabited, though not by anything he could see. At night, the wind pressed against the windows like whispers in a language he almost understood, and he convinced himself it was just the creak of old wood settling. One morning, while exploring the farthest pasture, he noticed crows circling low, their wings slicing the air in restless arcs. Following their cries, he reached a grove of cottonwoods. There, in the filtered light, he froze. A colossal figure hung from the largest tree, her body swaying gently, as if caught between earth and sky. She was a girl, but impossibly large, her hair spilling down like ropes, her feet brushing the tops of shrubs. Her skin had the pale stillness of marble, yet her presence made the entire grove feel alive in a terrible way. Terror should have driven him back, but awe kept him rooted. The girl's size dwarfed the land itself, as though she had grown from it, as though the farm had been waiting for her. He saw the rope around her neck, an enormous coil braided from vines, and wondered who, or what, could have hoisted her there. The ground beneath her was churned, as if something massive had struggled before surrendering to silence. Days passed with the vision burning into him. He avoided the grove, yet his thoughts circled it endlessly. At night he dreamed of her eyes opening, vast and sorrowful, staring down at him as though he were the trespasser. In the dreams, she whispered questions he could never answer, questions that pressed into his chest and left him waking with sweat soaking the sheets. The farm no longer felt like his. It felt like hers, and he was only the caretaker of her grave. Still, he couldn't stay away. One evening, drawn by a pull he could neither fight nor explain, he returned to the cottonwoods. The light was thin, dusk unraveling into night, and he stood beneath her shadow. Her face, even in stillness, carried the weight of despair that no words could capture. He raised a hand, almost reaching to touch her ankle, when the rope creaked. The sound was subtle, but in it he heard more than straying. It was language. A low groan that said, "You bought me with your fortune, though you never knew what you were buying." He staggered back, realizing the farm hadn't cost him money. It had cost him inheritance, an inheritance of sorrow, of a story older than he could fathom. The rancher's wealth was gone, but in its place, he had purchased a haunting, one that grew from the soil itself. And though he could leave the land, he knew the girl's shadow would follow him, towering, silent, asking forever what he owed. The rancher could not leave. He told himself each morning that he might sell the farm, that he could return to the city, rent an apartment, live small again. Yet when he reached for the phone, his hand stopped, as though invisible roots held his bones. The farm was not a piece of land to be traded away, it was a place that had chosen him. He had spent his fortune not on soil, not on barns, but on an inheritance of silence and shadow, bound in the form of that giant girl hanging in the cottonwoods. Every time he tried to busy himself, mending fences, clearing brush, painting the porch, his mind slipped back to her swaying body. He had begun to time the creak of the rope, counting the intervals, waiting for a pattern. Sometimes it was minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes not at all. But when it came, that groan of strained vine seemed to slide directly into his chest, a reminder that she was never still, not even in death. At night the dreams grew heavier. In the first dreams she only whispered. In later ones she began to move. He would see her feet dragging furrows into the earth, each step shaking the horizon. Her head tilted toward him, lips parting as if to breathe him in, and her eyes, vast oceans of grief, would hold him until he woke gasping. More than once he found himself standing in the yard at dawn, barefoot, with no memory of leaving his bed. Once he woke at the edge of the grove itself, the hem of her hair brushing his shoulder as if he had been invited closer. The rancher stopped eating properly. Bread molded in its bag, cans of beans sat unopened, meat spoiled in the fridge. He lost weight, his face sharpening into angles, and he stopped shaving. Each day blurred into the next, until time itself felt like part of her shadow. The farm, once alive with the smell of soil and grass, now carried a stale weight, as if all the air had been breathed already. And then came the rain. It was the kind of storm that swallows the horizon, a wall of black rolling across the plains. Thunder bellowed like something alive, and lightning revealed the silhouette of the cottonwoods over and over again, freezing her in strobe light flashes. With every strike he saw her body sway, her hair ripple, her arms dangling. But then, for the first time, he thought he saw her fingers curl. Just slightly, enough to convince him she was not a corpse at all but suspended between death and life, waiting for a signal. Driven by something between terror and devotion, he ran into the grove. Rain lashed his face, his boots sinking into mud, and he shouted up at her though he could not hear his own voice over the storm. He demanded to know who had hanged her. He demanded to know why she haunted him. But the only answer was the creak of rope and the crash of thunder. When lightning struck a tree nearby, splitting it down the middle, the air filled with the smell of ozone and burning wood. For an instant, he swore he saw her eyes open, reflecting the light like twin mirrors of the storm. The days after the storm were strange. The rancher discovered footprints in the mud beneath her body, enormous depressions, as though she had stepped down before being strung back up. They were impossibly deep, pooling with rainwater, and though he wanted to believe they were illusions, his hand fit inside them easily, like a child placing his palm against the outline of a god. He realized then that she had once walked this land, that she belonged to it, or it to her. Stories surfaced in his memory, fragments of tales told by old oilmen around campfires, tales he never paid attention to. Rumors of a people who were not people, who moved through plains long before cattle, before barbed wire, before men drew borders on maps. Beings tall as trees, some said, who carried grief so large it bent the seasons around them. He had thought them drunken myths. Now he lived in their remnant. He tried to research. The farm had no internet, and he avoided going into town, but he unearthed a box of old records left by the previous owner in the attic. Inside were deeds written in cramped handwriting, faded maps, and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to a man named Halvorsen, who had owned the farm generations ago. The entries were scattered, but the more the rancher read, the clearer it became that Halvorsen too had seen her. One entry stood out. The girl is larger every time I look. Not in body but in presence. She does not belong to a body but to the soil itself. I believe she is not dead, not alive, but bound. The rope is not rope, it is covenant. The rancher read that line again and again. Covenant. He felt the truth of it. He realized now why he could not leave the land. The deed he signed was only paper, but the true transaction was older. His fortune had been an offering, willingly placed, though he did not understand it at the time. He had bought into a covenant with grief itself. He began speaking to her. At first quietly, from the edge of the grove, and then later standing beneath her, shouting his questions into her silence. He confessed things too, things he had never told anyone. How he had chased money not out of hunger but out of fear of being forgotten. How he had ruined friendships, burned bridges, left lovers because he could not bear to stay still. How he thought the farm would redeem him. And now, how he could not decide if finding her was a curse or the first true thing that had ever happened to him. One evening, as he spoke, the creak of the rope shifted into rhythm. A steady sound, back and forth, like a pendulum. He realized it was answering him. Not words, but cadence. A language without vowels or consonants, but one that carried weight. It was grief measured out in intervals, grief that matched the beating of his heart. He fell to his knees in the mud, crying for reasons he could not name, and for the first time he felt her not as a specter but as a mirror. As the weeks bled into months, the rancher lost his sense of self. He no longer cared for the house, which sagged into disrepair. He no longer cared for his body, which grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. His only purpose was the grove. Sometimes he brought offerings, bowls of water, bread, or wildflowers from the pasture. He would set them at her feet, though they vanished by morning. Perhaps animals took them, perhaps not. One night, under a harvest moon, he heard her voice. Not in a dream, not in the creak of rope, but in the air itself. It was vast and low, like the sound of wind pressed through the earth. She spoke one word, "Stay." He obeyed. Time became fluid after that. Seasons shifted, yet he hardly marked them. Snow gathered on her shoulders in winter, melted into streams in spring, and still she hung. The rancher grew old without noticing. His beard whitened, his hands shook, but he never left. He belonged to her now, the way roots belong to soil. Eventually, others came, not buyers or neighbors, but wanderers, drawn perhaps by the same pull that had trapped him. They found him sitting at the edge of the grove, eyes fixed upward, lips moving as if in prayer. They asked what he was guarding. He told them only, "You will see." And when they followed his gaze, they did see. Some fled screaming, some fell to their knees. A few stayed, like him, caught in her gravity. The rancher realized then that he was not alone in covenant. She had always gathered keepers, each bound in turn, each spending their lives in the orbit of her sorrow. Halvorsen had been one, he was another, and now there would be more. A lineage not of blood, but of grief. In the quiet between storms, the rancher sometimes imagined what it would be like if she were cut down. If her feet touched soil again, if her arms moved, if she spoke in full words. He wondered if the earth would split open, if the horizon would tremble, if the world itself would remember the giants it had buried. He, both longed for it and dreaded it. For her release would mean the end of something, and he was no longer sure if that end was salvation or ruin. The last night of his life came without warning. He sat beneath her as always, the moon pale and high. He whispered his confession, how he no longer feared death, only forgetting. He asked her, finally, if she remembered him. The rope groaned, slow and steady, and he swore he heard her voice once more, whispering through the leaves, "Yes." He closed his eyes. When the dawn came, others found his body seated in the mud, head tilted upward, lips curved into the faintest smile. The covenant had claimed him, as it would claim them in time. And above, the giant girl still swayed, her shadow stretched across the land, her presence both wound and blessing, bound forever to those who dared call the farm their own. The girl's shadow did not end with the rancher's death. Those who came after, those who stumbled into the land by chance or calling, found themselves tangled in the same gravity. They spoke of him as if he had never left, as though his body had melted into the soil and his gaze had been absorbed into hers. When they knelt at the base of the cottonwoods, they sometimes swore they felt his breath in the wind, urging them closer, urging them to listen. One of them was a woman named Claire. She had not come for land or fortune but for silence. Her life in the city had shattered under 1,000 small betrayals, until she felt as hollow as a clay vessel struck too many times. Driving through back roads one evening, she saw the farm by chance, its fences sagging, the house a gray husk, the fields gone wild. Yet when she looked at the cottonwoods in the distance, something in her chest tightened, like an invisible rope cinching around her ribs. She knew without knowing that she was meant to stop. She stayed first for a night, sleeping in her car by the fence line. The night was louder than she expected. Crickets buzzing, owls calling, but beneath it all was a deeper sound, one that rose and fell like breath. At dawn she walked into the pasture and saw her. The giant girl swaying from the tree, her hair long as rivers, her face pale in the light. Claire froze, yet no scream came. Instead she felt recognition, as though meeting an old friend she had never seen before. She whispered, "I know you," and for an instant she swore the girl's lips curved upward in the faintest smile. Days became weeks, and Claire did not leave. She cleaned the abandoned house, though it still smelled faintly of mildew and dust. She repaired the porch enough to sit on it during evenings. She planted a small garden, though she ate little. Most of her time was spent beneath the cottonwoods, speaking aloud to the hanging girl. She told her things she had told no one else. How her father had left when she was a child. How her mother had loved her only through criticism. How every man she had given herself to had eventually taken something away and left nothing behind. Each confession felt less like an offering and more like an unlocking, as if the girl were a locked door and grief the only key. The longer she stayed, the more she felt the presence of those who had come before her. She found remnants in the soil, a rusted canteen, a fragment of a leather boot, a knife handle worn smooth. She even found, beneath the floorboards of the farmhouse, a word scrawled in faded ink. She will take your sorrow and make it her own, but you must never cut her down. The land will not bear it. Claire read the note again and again, wondering whose hand had written it. She guessed it might have been the rancher's, though she could not know. Her dreams began after the first month. They were vivid in ways waking life never was. In them, she stood at the edge of an endless field, and the giant girl stood upright in the distance, no longer hanging, her head rising above the horizon like a second moon. Each time, the girl took a step closer, her footfall shaking the earth, and Claire felt both terror and rapture. She would wake with tears on her face, whispering apologies she did not remember making. Other wanderers arrived, just as they had in the rancher's time. A drifter with sunburned skin and hollow eyes. A couple whose car had broken down on the road. A teenager running from something he refused to name. Each came for different reasons, yet each stayed when they saw her. The farm became a quiet gathering place, though no one spoke much. Words seemed unnecessary, even intrusive. They all shared the same orbit, circling the girl's shadow like moths around a flame too large to comprehend. Together they began to notice patterns. When storms gathered, her swaying grew heavier, almost violent, and the rope groaned like a ship straining at anchor. When the moon was full, her hair glimmered faintly, as though made of water reflecting starlight. On certain nights, they swore they heard her humming, a low, endless note that spread across the fields and vibrated in their bones. They never spoke of leaving. Leaving was no longer a choice. Claire grew thinner, her skin drawn tight across her cheekbones, her eyes brighter in the hollows of her face. She felt herself hollowing out, but she did not fear it. She understood now that emptiness was the currency required to stay near the girl. To keep her company, you had to pour yourself out until nothing remained, so that she could fill you with her silence. One night, in the deep of winter, Claire dreamed differently. In this dream, she stood not in a field but in the cottonwoods themselves, looking up at the girl. The rope was gone. The girl's body stood upright, her eyes open, her gaze fixed directly upon Claire. And in a voice that was both whisper and thunder, she said, "The covenant weakens. You will have to choose." Claire woke shivering, her breath clouding the cold air of the farmhouse. She did not know what the choice meant, but she felt it in her marrow. Something was shifting. The covenant that bound the girl to the tree was not eternal. It frayed with each confession, each offering, each keeper. One day it would snap. And when it did, the world would not remain the same. The others felt it too. They began to speak more often, their voices edged with unease. The drifter claimed he had seen the rope splitting, fibers hanging loose like strands of hair. The teenager said he had heard her whispering not words but a rhythm, a pulse that matched the beating of his own heart. The couple confessed they had both dreamed of the same image, the girl's feet touching the soil, and the earth cracking open beneath her weight. Winter dragged on, and hunger gnawed at them. Their garden was gone, supplies dwindled, but none of them left for town. They scavenged what they could, rationed scraps, and grew weaker. Yet even in weakness they remained tethered, bound not by necessity but by devotion. Hunger was nothing compared to the thought of abandoning her. Claire began spending entire nights beneath the cottonwoods, wrapped in a blanket, watching her sway in the moonlight. She began to notice movements too subtle for others, tiny shifts of her fingers, tremors in her eyelids, the faintest rise and fall of her chest as if she were breathing. Each sign confirmed what she already believed. The girl was not dead, not alive, but waiting. Waiting for release. By spring, the rope had frayed visibly. Each strand looked thinner, brittle, as though one strong wind might snap it. The others debated whether to intervene. Some feared, cutting it would unleash disaster. Others whispered that it was cruel to leave her hanging, that she deserved release after centuries of bondage. Claire remained silent, but inside her decision hardened. She remembered the girl's words in her dream, "You will have to choose." She understood now that the choice was hers. She waited until the others slept. On a night when the wind was calm and the stars sharp above, she took the rancher's old knife, the one she had found rusted beneath the floorboards, and walked into the grove. The girl swayed above her, hair spilling like rivers, eyes closed. Claire pressed a hand against the rope, feeling its roughness, its strange warmth, as if it carried a pulse of its own. She whispered, "Do you want this?" and in the silence that followed, she swore she heard the faintest word breathed through the branches. Yes. She began to cut. The knife was dull, the rope thick, and it took hours. Her hands blistered, bled, but she did not stop. With each slice the rope groaned, not in resistance but in release, like a long sigh escaping the lungs of the earth. When the final strand gave way, the world seemed to pause. The grove fell silent, the air itself holding its breath. Then the girl fell, not like a body, not like dead weight. She descended slowly, as if carried by unseen hands, her feet touching the ground with impossible grace. The earth trembled, the cottonwoods shuddered, and the stars above flickered as though doused in water. She opened her eyes. They were vast, reflecting not the moon but something deeper, an ocean of sorrow and memory older than the soil itself. The others stumbled from the farmhouse, drawn by the tremor, their faces pale in the moonlight. They saw her standing, her shadow stretching across the fields, taller than barns, taller than mountains. Some fell to their knees. Some screamed. But Claire only stood still, knife in hand, staring up into the abyss of those eyes. The girl spoke, not in human language, not in words at all, but in a resonance that filled every bone, every cell, every blade of grass. The message was clear though. I am not bound anymore. And then the ground split. From horizon to horizon, cracks tore through the fields, black chasms glowing faintly with a light that did not belong to the earth. Wind howled upward, carrying scents of salt and fire, as though the world beneath had been waiting to exhale. The girl stepped forward, and with each step the fissures widened, the air quaking. She was no longer sorrow contained but sorrow unbound, no longer covenant but consequence. Claire did not run. She felt no fear, only the certainty that this was what she had been brought here for, not to keep the covenant, but to end it. And as the others scattered into the night, their screams vanishing into the wind, Claire raised her arms and whispered, I choose you. The girl's gaze fell upon her, vast and unblinking. And in that gaze Claire felt everything, every grief ever buried in the soil, every cry swallowed by history, every shadow ignored. She felt the weight of the rancher, of Halvorsen, of every keeper before her, their lives pouring into her veins. It was unbearable, it was infinite, and yet, for the first time in her life, Claire felt whole. The earth did not stop trembling after the girl's feet touched soil. Each step she took seemed to echo across distances too vast to measure, as though her movement resounded not just in the land of the farm but in the marrow of the planet itself. The cottonwoods bent low, their branches snapping, leaves scattering into the night like startled birds. The farmhouse rattled on its foundation, its windows shivering with cracks that spidered outward. The others, the drifter, the teenager, the couple, had fled into the fields, stumbling blindly in the dark, but Claire remained at the base of the tree, breath shallow, eyes wide, body pulled forward by gravity far greater than fear. The girl stood before her now, no longer a hanged specter, but a towering presence whose skin seemed woven from pale stone and shadow. Her hair streamed across the air as if it were woven from rivers, strands shifting as though carrying currents within them. Her eyes were not eyes but dark oceans, yet Claire could see herself reflected in them. Her own gaunt figure, knife in hand, face lifted in something between awe and surrender. The girl bent her head, an impossible motion that shook the ground like thunder, until her gaze fell directly upon Claire. A sound welled up from her, not spoken but resonant, vibrating through ribs, through teeth, through the soil itself. It was not language, not as Claire had known it, but it carried meaning all the same. You have broken the rope. You have broken the silence. Claire dropped the knife without realizing. Her knees buckled, but she refused to bow. She whispered, barely audible above the groaning earth, I had no choice. The girl tilted her head, a movement so slow it seemed like the shifting of mountains. Another resonance filled the air, deeper this time, and Claire's vision blurred with tears. It was a question, though no words shaped it. Did you do it for me, or for yourself? The question cracked something inside Claire. All her life, she had sought someone else's voice to guide her. Her father's absence, her mother's disapproval, her lover's dismissals had all left hollows she filled with desperation. Was this different? Did she cut the rope because the girl had asked, or because Claire wanted to be the one who mattered enough to free her? She could not answer. She only lowered her head and whispered, I don't know. The girl straightened, her shadow stretching across the horizon, swallowing the moonlight. The cracks in the ground spread farther, glowing faintly from beneath with a light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Wind poured upward, pulling with it the smell of brine, of ash, of something older than the air above. The soil trembled underfoot, and Claire knew she stood on a threshold between worlds. The others had not gone far. Their cries carried back across the fields, screams of terror, pleas to gods they had abandoned long ago. The drifter stumbled toward the grove again, his face twisted with desperation. "Put her back," he shouted, voice hoarse. "You don't know what you've done." Claire turned, her chest heaving, but no words formed. The girl did not move, only watched as the drifter charged forward, swinging a broken branch like a weapon. He raised it high, aiming for the girl's ankle, but the moment the wood struck her, it shattered into dust. The drifter fell to his knees, clutching at his hands as though burned, and when he looked up, his eyes were empty, pupils swallowed into black voids. He screamed once, then collapsed face first into the soil, unmoving. The teenager screamed louder, stumbling backward, his voice cracking. He ran, vanishing into the darkness, his footfalls swallowed by the quake of the earth. The couple clung to each other, sobbing, before retreating toward the farmhouse. Though the house itself leaned as if it might collapse at any moment. Claire watched them go but did not move. She could not. Her body was no longer her own. She was bound to the girl now, as though her bones were threads in the rope that had once held her. The girl took another step, and the earth's fissures widened. Out from the cracks rose not fire, not lava, but memory. Shadows of people long dead drifted upward, their faces pale, their mouths moving in silent screams. They rose like smoke, dissolving into the air, and as they did, Claire recognized something terrible. Each shadow carried the shape of sorrow, the kind that weighed generations. A mother clutching a stillborn child. A man weeping into empty hands. A soldier collapsing in a trench. A widow at a graveside. Grief upon grief, centuries upon centuries, all bound into the soil of the earth, all now rising because the covenant had broken. Claire gasped, clutching her chest as though the grief were pouring into her lungs. She staggered, her knees sinking into the trembling ground. The girl's gaze never left her, but Claire could not hold it. The sorrow was too vast, too endless. She felt herself unraveling, every wound she had carried in life opening wider, every memory of abandonment and loneliness stretching until it seemed she might dissolve entirely. Yet beneath the crushing weight, a strange clarity sparked. This was not destruction for its own sake. The girl was not bringing ruin. She was revealing what had always been there, the truth buried beneath the soil, the grief ignored by those who tilled it, built upon it, claimed it as their own. She was the vessel of sorrow, and now she was loosed. Claire rose slowly, though her body shook, her breath ragged. She whispered upward, "What do you want of me?" The girl's response was a resonance that filled the night. "Walk with me." Claire's heart stuttered. To walk with her meant abandoning the others, abandoning the world she had known, stepping into a grief so vast it might swallow her whole. Yet she felt no hesitation. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Yes." The girl moved forward, each step carving new scars into the land. Claire followed, stumbling, her body tiny in the shadow of the colossus, yet tethered by something stronger than fear. Together they crossed the pasture, the fields, the fences that once marked the limits of property. The earth shuddered beneath them, the fissures spreading outward, carrying sorrow like rivers spilling over. Animals fled in every direction, cattle lowing in panic, birds bursting from trees, coyotes howling from distant ridges. Yet nothing could stop the girl's stride. They walked for hours, or perhaps days, time unraveled in her presence. The sky shifted from night to day to night again, the sun and moon circling like frightened animals. Claire's body weakened, her legs bruised and bleeding, but each time she thought she might collapse, the girl's shadow steadied her, filling her veins with just enough strength to continue. They came at last to the edge of a canyon, a vast wound in the land Claire had never seen before. The fissures from the farm had converged here, opening into an abyss that glowed with the same faint light as the cracks. The girl stopped, standing at its edge, her form silhouetted against the void. Claire staggered beside her, gasping for breath, her body trembling as if it might collapse into dust. The girl bent again, lowering her gaze to Claire. Another resonance filled the air, heavier than any before. This is where it began. This is where it must end. Claire peered into the abyss. Shapes moved within it, countless figures rising and falling, shadows of grief too many to count. They stretched upward, reaching with hands that dissolved into smoke, their silent cries filling her mind until she thought she might go mad. She clutched her head, screaming, I can't carry it. The girl's resonance shook her bones. You already are. Claire collapsed to her knees, tears pouring down her face. She understood now. The covenant had not bound the girl alone. It had bound all who came to her, all who lived upon the land. The rope had held not just her body but the sorrow of the earth itself, condensed into her form so that the world above could continue without breaking. By cutting it, Claire had loosed that sorrow, and now she was its vessel, its keeper. The girl was free, but freedom had a price. The girl extended her hand, massive, pale, fingers longer than tree trunks. Claire hesitated, her heart hammering, before raising her own trembling hand. Her palm met the girl's fingertip, a contact both impossible and real. In that touch she felt the weight of the world pour into her, every grief, every loss, every silence. It was unbearable. She screamed, her voice breaking, yet she did not pull away. The girl's voice filled her mind. Do not fear sorrow. Fear forgetting it. The abyss roared, wind howling upward, and the girl stepped forward into it. Her form descended slowly, vanishing into the void, her hair streaming behind her like rivers falling into darkness. Claire reached after her, screaming, but the girl's gaze lingered, vast and eternal, until it disappeared into the depths. Silence followed. The earth stilled. The cracks ceased to spread. The glow dimmed. For the first time in what felt like forever, the night was quiet. Claire knelt at the canyon's edge, her chest heaving, her body broken. She was alone. The girl was gone, swallowed by the abyss. Yet Claire knew she had not left her. The weight in her chest, the sorrow in her veins, was proof enough. The covenant had changed hands. The girl was free, but Claire was bound. When dawn came, she rose unsteadily, her body shaking, and began the walk back toward the farm. Claire walked back across the trembling earth as though she carried mountains in her chest. Each step was harder than the last, her legs stiff with exhaustion, her lungs raw from the air she had breathed in the abyss. Yet she moved forward, because there was nothing else left. The girl had descended, but her weight had not vanished. It had only shifted, pouring into Claire like water filling an emptied vessel. The farm lay silent when she returned. The house leaned further to one side, as if sighing under the burden of years. The cottonwoods stood broken, branches splintered, their bark scarred from the strain of holding her for so long. And in the pasture, scattered across the grass, were remnants of the others. The drifter's body lay stiff and gray, the couple were nowhere to be seen, and the teenager's footprints disappeared into the horizon as though he had been swallowed whole. Claire did not search for them. She already knew what the land did with those who fled. It kept their shadows. She collapsed onto the porch steps and sat there for hours, staring out at the field. The sun rose, fell, and rose again, yet she did not move. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, thirst dried her throat, but the weight in her chest consumed everything else. She was no longer simply Claire. She was something more and less, a vessel of grief, a keeper of memory. The girl had walked into the abyss, but her covenant had not ended, it had passed on. At night, Claire dreamed again. But this time the dreams did not show her the girl towering above fields. Instead they showed faces, hundreds, then thousands, then countless more, each one marked by sorrow. A mother who buried her child in winter. A son who dug graves after war. A daughter who carried the silence of abuse. A man who died alone in a hospital bed. The faces came faster than she could comprehend, each pressing into her mind until she woke weeping, her chest burning with grief that was not hers but belonged to them all. She tried to write them down. She scavenged paper from the farmhouse, pens that still bled ink, and filled page after page with descriptions of the faces, their losses, their voices. Her handwriting shook, smears of tears blurred the ink, but she wrote because she feared what would happen if she didn't. The memories might vanish into silence again, and silence was the true curse. Days bled into months. Her body withered, but her eyes burned brighter. She no longer sought food the way she once had. Sometimes she ate a little, sometimes nothing at all, yet she never starved. The grief sustained her, a weight so heavy it became its own nourishment. She was a shell, but shells could hold oceans. Others came again, as they always did. A farmer whose crops had failed. A woman carrying ashes in a tin. A boy who had lost his sister in a fire. Each wandered onto the land, drawn by something they could not name, and each found Claire on the porch or in the field, her body fragile but her gaze immense. They asked her what the farm was, why they felt compelled to come, what the shadow in their dreams meant. Claire told them nothing at first. She only looked at them, and in her silence they found themselves confessing. They poured their grief out, weeping, trembling, speaking words they had never dared speak aloud. And as they did, Claire felt the weight in her chest shift, absorbing each sorrow like water soaking into cracked soil. She carried it for them, and when they finished, they left lighter, though none of them ever returned. But the land kept changing. Wherever the fissures had torn, the soil did not heal. Instead, strange growths sprouted, plants with silver leaves that shone under moonlight, flowers that never opened fully but wept clear droplets that tasted of salt. Animals avoided those places, yet birds sometimes landed in the branches and sang with voices that sounded human, broken with sorrow. The farm became a place whispered of in nearby towns, though no one dared claim it. Years passed. Claire grew old, though time no longer measured her as it did others. Her hair whitened, her skin thinned, but her back remained straight, her eyes unbowed. The burden in her chest never diminished. If anything, it grew heavier, because grief never ceased. The world fed it endlessly: wars, losses, betrayals, silences. At night, the dreams became harder to bear. Sometimes she woke screaming, the sound carrying across the fields like a signal to the restless dead. One winter, as snow drifted down in silence, a man arrived. He was not like the others. He did not come weeping or seeking. He walked with purpose, his boots leaving deep prints, his coat heavy, his eyes sharp. He found Claire by the grove, standing before the broken cottonwoods, and studied her with a frown. "You're the one they talk about," he said. "The keeper." Claire said nothing. Her breath clouded the air, her body trembling beneath the cold, but her gaze did not waver. He stepped closer. "You don't have to carry it. You know that. Whatever covenant you think you made, it doesn't have to bind you." Claire's lips cracked as she spoke. Her voice was faint, yet it carried the weight of centuries. "It does. You don't understand. If I set it down, it returns to silence. And silence buries everything." The man's frown deepened. He pulled from his coat a long blade, its edge sharp, gleaming even in the gray light. "Then I'll set you free." Claire did not flinch. She spread her arms, frail as they were, and whispered, "Do it. But you will inherit what I leave behind." The man hesitated, his knuckles whitening on the hilt. Something flickered in his eyes: fear, recognition. He dropped the blade, cursing, and staggered back. "I can't," he muttered. "It's too much." He fled into the snow, vanishing without a trace. Claire watched him go and knew he would not return. Few could bear the thought of inheriting sorrow. Spring came, and with it new wanderers. But fewer stayed now. The land itself had grown heavier, its air thick with grief. Storms lingered longer, rain tasted bitter, and even the stars seemed dimmer above. Claire knew what it meant. The covenant was stretching to its limit. She could carry the sorrow of the earth only so long before it demanded release. Her dreams confirmed it. She no longer saw faces alone but landscapes splitting apart, oceans boiling, skies cracking. The girl appeared again, towering, her eyes dark with endless weight. She spoke the same words each time: "It is not enough to carry. You must decide where to lay it down." Claire understood, though the knowledge gutted her. She could not simply hold grief forever. To carry it without release was another form of silence. The world needed remembering, but also transformation. The sorrow had to be given shape, or else it would consume her and vanish into nothingness. So she began to write again. Not just faces, but stories. She filled pages with the lives of the grieving, stitching them into narratives that bound them together. She wrote of mothers and fathers, of wars and children, of silence and shadows. She wrote until her hands bled, until stacks of paper filled the farmhouse. The words were jagged, uneven, but alive. She knew she was not merely recording. She was giving form to the sorrow, weaving it into something the world could see. And the world noticed. Travelers began to arrive not by chance but by rumor. They came from distant towns, distant countries, carrying their grief and leaving with fragments of Claire's words. They whispered of her writings as scripture, not of gods but of sorrow itself, honest and unflinching. Some left copies, carrying them into the world beyond, until the words began to spread like seeds. Claire grew weaker. Her body failed, her breath shortened, but her mind burned brighter. She knew her time was ending. The girl had chosen her as vessel, but vessels cracked eventually. She did not fear death. She feared only leaving the burden unfinished. One night, in her final dream, the girl appeared once more. She was vast, standing not on land but in a sky filled with stars, her shadow covering constellations. She looked at Claire with eyes that burned like oceans under moonlight and spoke, "You have carried well. But grief is not meant to be kept. It is meant to become." Claire woke with tears freezing on her cheeks. She knew what to do. She gathered her writings, every page, every smear of ink, and carried them into the grove. She stacked them at the base of the broken cottonwoods, her body shaking, her breath shallow. And with the last of her strength, she struck a match and lit them. The fire spread quickly, flames leaping high, smoke curling into the night sky. The papers burned, curling into ash, but their words did not vanish. The smoke carried them upward, scattering across the wind, carried into every corner of the horizon. Claire felt the weight in her chest lighten, not because it was gone, but because it was shared. The grief was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the world. As the fire consumed the last page, Claire sank to her knees, her body folding. She closed her eyes and felt the girl's presence one final time, not towering, not distant, but close, kneeling beside her. She felt a vast hand on her shoulder, gentle as a mother's touch. And she heard the words, spoken not in resonance but in a voice soft and clear, "Well done." Claire exhaled once, slowly, and did not inhale again. The farm lay silent, the ashes of her writing scattered into the soil and air. But the covenant had changed forever. No longer bound to rope, no longer bound to a single vessel, the sorrow of the earth had been loosed into stories, into words that traveled farther than shadows ever could. People carried them, repeated them, remembered them. And in remembering, they kept the covenant alive. The land did not heal, but it did not break further. The fissures remained, glowing faintly under moonlight, reminders of what had been buried. The silver plants grew taller, the flowers wept their salt, and birds still sang with broken voices. But those who came found not only grief, but also something greater. They found witness, and far beneath the soil, where the abyss stretched endlessly, the girl walked still, her shadow vast, her sorrow endless. Yet she was no longer alone. She was carried in words, in memory, in the hearts of those who whispered her story. She had been hanged in silence, but she was freed in remembrance. The covenant endured, not in chains, not in secrecy, but in every voice that dared to speak of grief without shame. And so the story ended not with silence, but with echo. An echo carried across fields, across oceans, across generations. The echo of a rancher who bought land and found more than he bargained for. The echo of Claire, who cut the rope and bore the weight. The echo of a girl too vast to forget. The world trembled still, but it trembled with memory. And memory was stronger than silence. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.